Thank you for the introduction. And I should say, Geert Wilders' PVV appointing artists as ministers, that's actually a little bit of a reality, because maybe not everyone knows that Martin Bosma actually has a background as a media activist artist in the 1990s, involved in the Next 5 Minutes conferences and in subversive TV programs before he kind of switched careers. And that also, sometimes we can wonder whether, activist art projects can be the best training programs for politicians like him. But that brings me back to André Breton, who said in 1920, and this is a riff on it, of the same quote by the artist, publisher, activist Eva Weinmeier, one publishes to find comrades. And maybe that's, maybe that's the kind of thing that unites all these practices in the 1920s. Maybe that's also something that works for all the initiatives that have been covered here today, also for Grafische Werkplaats since the 1970s. But perhaps the terms under which one finds comrades and how one finds comrades change. And that's what I'm trying to speculate a little bit about in my lecture, and must say these are really unfinished thoughts. So it's question marks and a little bit speculative. So first of all, I think if you talk about artist-run printing, publishing, then maybe and in its relation to activism, then we have several traditions or points of departure that partly also overlap. I mean, if I now differentiate them, then sometimes it's also a little bit artificial, and I think this has been really beautifully covered in the talk before with Knust. So, for example, classic political activist publishing is what you get, for example, if you go to Fort van Schakel in Amsterdam, where here, for example, on the left side, we have the whole zine section also of self-published political activist magazines, where there's now a huge overlap also with the culture of, that was also mentioned by Knust, by artist book fairs and zine fairs. But still, I would say it's a slightly different realm. And what was said before about the kind of animosity between political squatters and artists, maybe it has softened a little bit, but it still exists as two different fields. Grafische Werkplaats, I don't need to comment on this, this is the official plate. So something different, maybe related. I'm also thinking of the punk tradition, where the idea was, to make things in an extreme radical DIY fashion and not practice the good craft, to violate the rules of the craft, and also be somewhere in between, I would say, the artistic approach and the classical political activist approach. And more recently, these kind of artist-run, often self-funded communities. This is something super recent in Rotterdam, just from last weekend. De Boog is a former printer who has now been taken over because they no longer were commercially viable as an artist collective. So it's basically a vereniging, so you can become a member of it, and they're giving workshops, and they're working very much on a kind of community model. That seems to be something that is a little bit newer, also because the idea is that the people running it are not necessarily experts on the printing machines. So what I think might be new, and correct me if I'm wrong, maybe I'm simplifying things again. When we had the beginning of these, let's say, artist-run initiatives in the 1920s, and then even stronger in the 1960s, 70s, the idea was very often to give artists access to technology that otherwise was industrial and out of reach for artists. That could be printing. But another really good example that I also want to cover in my presentation was, for example, filmmaking, artist-run film labs, 16mm and otherwise, where it was simply a matter of, back then in the early 1970s, they were called filmmaker co-ops, of creating initiatives where people would have access to the technology, which back then was industrial technology. The same with artist-run sound studios, etc., etc. And I think what has changed in the meantime is, back then, this was industrial high technology that somehow needed to be appropriated and made accessible and shared among artists. But nowadays, these technologies are often old technologies, and which have partly been deindustrialized. Maybe for printing, this is a little bit less the case than for other technologies. I think, still, we mentioned the stencil printer. I mean, this is the original Stettner stencil printer, and you saw it on the previous flyer. This is also something, a technology that is being used and reactivated by artists, not even in the newer form of the electronic Riso printers, but also in these older mechanical forms. Which then suddenly means, or another example, was I too fast? No. I mentioned artist-run film labs. There is one in Rotterdam, Filmbergplatz, Rotterdam. By the way, also more officially a commercial venture, but I think also run in the spirit of an artist-run film lab is the Super 8 Reversal Lab of Frank Boitsma here in Den Haag, or Labor Berlin, and where you see that what is suddenly happening is that now that the industry has divested from these technologies, that the artists suddenly need to take care of it. And here in this case, this is actually our colleague Nan Wang from Willem de Kooning Academy, up to the point of building their own cameras, or building their own technical devices. And from print, at least I know, and there are much better experts here in the room than me, that, for example, one of the things is that through the shrinking of the publishing and printing industry, it has become more difficult, for example, to source papers, or at least have a diversity of papers, that some printing technologies have been more difficult to acquire. We heard the example of the self-made inks, etc., etc. So suddenly something happens. It's no longer the fact that there is this question of how to get access to the technology, but suddenly, as artists, you become almost responsible for the technology. In the case of analog filmmaking, you can even say this is clearly the case. Basically, the artist-run film labs, and there is also a website for it, filmlabs.org, where you see it's a worldwide movement, a network. There exist several dozens of them in all continents. They're basically the ones who keep this technology alive. At the moment, with some exceptions in Hollywood, but only on a very large scale. If Tarantino wants to make his new film in 35mm, then he will still get the technology. But for the rest, it's mostly, let's say, these bottom-up DIY, almost, not having any material or financial resources, initiatives that carry on this technology. So what does that actually mean? It means that if we think together art practice and activist practice, that it's no longer just a question of media experimentation versus message or form and content, but suddenly it's also about the medium itself. Suddenly the activism is not just an activism with the medium or through the medium, but it's also an activism about the medium, that you think of, how to work with this. This is another example, for example, the JK optical printer, which is a machine that allows you to basically make tricks and optical tricks with analog film. And you see this is actually DIY technology, which is based on a Bolex camera that has been rebuilt. So suddenly you also get into this territory of, tinkering, technological experimentation, technological DIY. And it brings us also quite close, I would say, to hacker culture. And maybe this is a link that was not seen for a long time. If you see what hack labs, hacker initiatives have done, is also to kind of critically think of the technology, how to use it, but also how to repurpose it. This here is a hack lab from Brooklyn, and I find it, for example, that they have interesting that they have a sewing machine there on the table, as part of the technologies that they're experimenting with. So maybe this is a link that we wouldn't have seen 20 years ago, but that now becomes more clear, that in all these initiatives there are, and maybe there are also no longer classical artist-run initiatives in the sense that everyone who's there has an art school degree or is a professional artist, but that these become more kind of community initiatives of people who are interested to join these non-profit initiatives and put their time in it. And this is a way of working that we know much better from activism. I mean, in political activism also, you don't have a political science degree or a sociology degree or a social work degree in order to engage, but you just do it. I think that's also something that we're currently seeing. I clearly also see in an initiative, printmaking initiative like De Boog in Rotterdam. This is also such an example of then an experimental art practice, and we have seen it with Knust, how then adopting the Viso printer and using it in a way how it was actually not intended suddenly resulted also in a new aesthetic and forms of expression that were not in the mainstream. And this is an example that's coming more from hacker culture, where an electronic musician composer composed the 1-bit symphony. You can also buy it here in the Netherlands. It's not expensive, even costs only 20 euros, not more than a normal CD, but it's actually an electronic device. It's a self-built electronic chip that generates the symphony, and it comes out of such a hack lab that we showed before. And I would say this is also a publication, right? Maybe we also have to kind of expand the idea of what a publication is. And I would even go further than that and say maybe we have to rethink the relation of art and publishing, but that comes in a later slide. So that's maybe the one step that we're still missing, that all these initiatives still exist partly in different universes. So printmaking in the universes of the, as Knust really nicely explained nowadays, of the artist book fairs, these in kind of hacker culture, or also the film labs have their own kind of ecology of festivals and residencies. And that is a really big question for me in the future, whether these different, you could say, media-specific social movements, social artistic movements can converge or create synergies in the future and not exist in the separate silos. So if you go back to publishing, then perhaps it means that we somehow, also printmaking and publishing wasn't necessarily the same thing. I mean, Knust really brought the two things together, and everything that came after Knust, everyone who adopted the Knust model. But printmaking used to be also something rather conservative, a kind of fine art technique, not necessarily a publishing technique, at best a technique for making an artwork in a limited edition and selling it as an artwork. But what we already saw in the last decades is that printmaking, experimental printmaking and DIY publishing or small edition publishing converged into one activity. Maybe for a young generation, it's even no longer known that these were two separate activities. So these have converged, and then, as I tried to explain with the previous slides, since now these initiatives basically have become caretakers of these technologies and these media, so it's like an activation of these media, also an activation that not necessarily in the ways how the industry that used to produce them in the past imagined the ways of using, and it's also an activism. So it's like a combination of a media, social activation, activism. This is like the best word or the best phrasing I could come up with at the moment. Maybe there are better ways of somehow explaining what is happening in this field. Now, the question is, for me, how is this similar or different to existing artist-run practices? If you have this kind of strange new conglomerate of media, collective activism, social activations. And this is a little homage to this place here, because West had a big project on Marshall McLuhan a couple of years ago, which I was also part of, to full disclaimer. I think it is indeed to what also Knust mentioned, what was mentioned in the last talk about graphic matters, the relation of medium and message. Yeah? So what I want to try, I'm someone who originally comes from literary studies and academic cultural theory. I want to try something like this. It's super speculative and really take it with a grain of salt. It's very sketchy. I just made it in the last 2 days, and it needs more work. But I try to kind of sketch a preliminary kind of communication or media model for what we're currently encountering, or what we have encountered in the past and what is now happening. And I think it has to do with this relation between the medium and the message. Yeah? This relation has already changed through the fact that suddenly the medium is not just a thing that you use in order to get a message across, but a thing that becomes something that is part of your artistic practice, and that you're trying to kind of question, reinvent, experiment with, but also that is linked to the way how you're publishing, how you're making a book or a film, etc. So this is, of course, it's like textbook communication theory, right? Shannon Weaver, Jacobson, and others, for those who may have had that in their college or university or maybe even high school classes. So I just reproduced it. Yeah? You have a sender, you have a receiver, there's a message, and there's medium, and there's also noise. That's the idea of Shannon Weaver, that any kind of communication, any kind of information transmission over radio or print always has an element of noise in it, and you have to deal with it. For example, this communication theory was originally developed at the research labs of Bell Company, of AT&T, so it was actually a way of kind of how to deal with line noise and quality of phone calls. Yeah? But then the proposal was actually it applies to any kind of medium. It doesn't not just apply to phone calls or radio. You can also apply it, for example, to visual communication, to my speaking now. So now I'm a sender. There is also some noise, for example, through my weird English pronunciation as a native German speaker, or ways that I might not clearly pronounce or articulate or use bad words for what I want to try what I'm trying to get across. So, for example, correcting myself now is introducing noise into my communication with a message that travels over this medium here, the speakers, to you as receivers. Very classical model. So, how in the beginning I had this photograph of Voigt van Schakel, the political social activist bookstore in Amsterdam, and which is really classical, like in the classical left-wing squatter activist mode of publishing. And there I would say, and I'm just repeating what was said in the conversation with Knust. It's really funny, we didn't prepare this. This is pure coincidence, that in these kind of classical forms of activism, the focus is really on the message. Yeah? There's a political message you want to get across. And often the medium is a secondary concern. Yeah? The form in which it is done, for example, whether, which typography you use, which means of visual expression you use is a secondary concern. Yeah? That's also typical for propaganda in many cases. If it's a concern, if aesthetics or the materiality is a concern, then only to improve the message, only to serve the message. But it's not really a concern in itself. And of course, the whole idea is to get a message from the sender to the receiver. Yeah? That in propaganda even stronger than in other forms of activism. You want to convince people of your message. Okay. Traditional printmaking, where I really mean this kind of fine art printmaking. There you could say maybe the focus is really on the medium. It's really on the materiality. It's on the artwork. It's on the craft. Yeah? Then if you go into punk DIY, I had this as a slide in the beginning, right? There things are already changing. So the real classical punk scenes that I grew up with, and that was in the early 1980s as a teenager. That's actually how I started my whole activities or career. I made a punk fanzine when I was 13 years old. I think the classic. I'm thinking of the classical punk scene where you go half drunken to a punk concert, and you barely register what is happening there, and then in your drunkenness you go to the typewriter at night and you cut out some tabloid newspapers and your half-drunken memories of the concert, you paste it together, you get up in the afternoon the next day and you just have enough energy to go to the copy shop and make 20 copies of it, and then in the evening you go to the next punk concert to distribute your zine, right? This is the kind of classical mode, like Sniffing Glue or these early punk zines. And there I would say it's more about the message, yeah? It's more about the narrative, telling how the punk story was, but also dealing with the noise. It's really dealing with all the factors that normally should not be part of proper publishing, yeah? As opposed, for example, to a newspaper music critic going to a concert and writing about it. So everything that is the background noise suddenly gets amplified and becomes even the aesthetic, and maybe that also has to deal with a reflection of the medium. What I see now with artist DIY print making, and that's like the culture we are in now, and also what was beautifully described by Knust as the development of the last 10 years, that basically everyone has become kind of traveling traders on these artist book fairs that take place all over the world. And I'm myself also part of such a collective. It's called Display Distribute, and based in Hong Kong. And all the discussions are, should we go to this fair or not? And what should we take, etc., etc. That has become a large part of what these collectives are now doing. You could say, yes, there is a similar it's dealing with the materiality of the medium. If you go to the book fairs and artist scene fairs, it also incorporates the noise. It's as was explained by Knust. It's not about the perfect, the clean, the offset printmaking. It's also about the roughness of the medium, or things that are not entirely predictable, and embracing chance in the process. With the message, I'm not quite so clear. I mean, I was just a couple of months ago, I co-wrote an essay with Mark van Elburg from Zine Depot Arnhem and Clara Balaguer, who's my colleague in Rotterdam, which we called a defense of crappy print. Yeah? We see that in the zine fairs, the level of artisanal finishing gets higher and higher. And this kind of original punk quality of zine making and DIY publishing seems to be lost, or seems to be gradually lost. So there is also a question whether sometimes what you see, if you want to be a little bit more pessimistic in the artist DIY printmaking culture, that there's like an overemphasis on the medium. And often let's say the craft of the medium itself is, it's really the medium is the message, in the sense that it's about the materiality first and foremost. Now, but what I think is happening in these larger ecologies, in these bigger communities, where also these different practices intersect, so these self-organized collective communities, that somehow these things come together in the best case. Yeah? So this kind of new conglomerate of different artist-run DIY practices, where first of all there are community processes in the sense that they are much more inclusive than in the past, and not only involving professional artists. This is like a spillover from punk DIY and activism, but then also the noise, the medium, the message, the community become all part of one process. That's maybe what we can see, especially in, maybe also a little bit more in non-Western practices than in Western practices. If I look, for example, at publishing collectives in East Asia. The big question for me here is, and I quickly mentioned that before, is, isn't the whole concept, the whole system of art becoming a burden for these practices? Shouldn't we rather embrace the term of publishing? You could say publishing is a much more inclusive concept than that of art. Doesn't it rather help to say all these practices not only the printmaking practices, but also the filmmaking practices, the alternative instrument making practices, the hacker practices are all alternative forms of publishing. And that also makes it easier to talk about this. And also, I think what we're experiencing more and more, that these kind of activities or communities have more and more difficulties of actually finding their way or getting adequate support in the art system. Why is that the case? Actually, I first should say that this idea of kind of rebranding or changing the name of art, and just say, let's get rid of this whole art thing and let's just call it publishing. This is not my idea, but it actually comes from Jan Vos from Boekie Woekie in Amsterdam. Maybe you know the place. It's one of the oldest artist-run bookstores and also small publishers in the Netherlands. They just had lost their building. This is a panorama picture of their old space that they lost. By the way, I misspelled Boekie Woekie. It's an O-E and not a double O. They said this is actually what their whole mission was from the beginning on. From when they first established a shop in the early 1980s, they say actually our whole proposal was to create an alternative to the art system, and like a democratic and a low-cost and an accessible way of alternative to the art system, and also very consciously in a tourist neighborhood and with tourist postcards outside so that people would come into the shop who would normally not come into an art space in order to kind of rethink what actually art can mean for society, and then say, yeah, publishing is something that we find is a more democratic concept than art. So credits to them for having done this first. I think also it goes back to the idea of, and this is also where Boekie Woekie is historically coming from, of Fluxus in the 1960s, where there was a similar drive to say, actually, we want to get rid of the whole notion of fine art. We want to bring art into the streets, in this case here with a street theater performance. And the first performance we had today was really such a classical Fluxus performance. I wasn't even sure, was it based on Fluxus scores by any chance? Did you use Fluxus, original Fluxus scores from the 1960s for it? I wasn't sure.
Were his own scores, I think.
Yeah, you use, yeah, okay.
Yeah? Okay, to elaborate a little bit,
yeah.
I guess if we think about in a really rock music sense, some of them are covers,
Yes.
and some of them are original scores.
Yes.
And some are actually blueprints for installations.
Okay,
But
yes.
yeah, it's a good catch. The whole format is also a reference to scores of Dick Higgins.
Yes, that's what I thought.
Strictly in the same format of title, block.
Dick Higgins was one of the core members of American Fluxus, who also founded his own alternative publishing house called Something Else Press, and was one of the instigators of this kind of artist-run publishing movements very early on, already in the 1960s. Yeah? So again, with the original idea of democratizing, that was formerly was called art, by literally bringing it out into the public. I think I can really recommend this also as, let's say, a kind of historical follow-up to this. The Publishing Manifestos Anthology, edited by Michalis Pichler, who, by the way, is one of the co-organizers of the Misread Artist Book Fair in Berlin. And that's basically kind of historical groundwork that they did. They looked at all the kinds of instances where artists in the 20th and 21st century thought about DIY forms and alternative forms of publishing, and also the politics of publishing, and assembled them in this anthology. So it all sounds nice, right? You can all be happy and go together. Okay, we have these new community practices, and artists also have a really clearly defined social role. We also heard it from Dominique, and we're opening up to new communities, and we become the caretaker of these technologies. Yes, but then in practice, yeah, what are the issues? I think it means an enormous amount of work, an enormous amount of labor. So suddenly, when you, for example, run a printmaking space, not only as, let's say, an artist collective with, you know, all people who graduated from art school and you speak the same language, but you actually turn it into an open community space, that creates a lot of friction. You become a kind of social worker. These are maybe skills that you never had. How do you deal with this? Yeah? This requires completely new skills, in many cases for artists, than what they normally used to have. By the way, this is a photo that I made myself from a zine event in Rotterdam, where the idea was it's not just a zine fair, but it's actually an event where people make zines and encouraged and also helped in making their own zines. Yeah, and in this case, education. So because it's not like you have a community of people who learned at least the basics of their skills in an art school or as part of their art practice, but you reach out to new communities. That means you constantly need to teach people these things from scratch. This can also lead to conflicts. For example, if you have machines that are no longer being produced, that are difficult to maintain, difficult to repair, and you need to let people work with it who are not skilled with it, and maybe they break the machines. The constant problem of the film labs is also a problem of these community-oriented print spaces that, for example, tell people how to use these old stencil printers. Yeah, knowledge transfer. That's also the problem is also that now that basically artists run DIY initiatives, which are not institutional, which are not funded, which are not archives, are suddenly in charge of kind of preserving these technologies, maybe also developing them or adapting them for the future. There becomes a huge problem with knowledge transfer. Yeah, I mean, again, if I look at Knust, somehow in the case of Riso and stencil presses, it happened organically through newer generations picking up the knowledge in their own way. But when you are gone, I mean, so much knowledge will be left. Will you ever have the chance in your life to, for example, get, I don't know, funding for 5 years to write down all your knowledge about Riso printing in a manual for the next generation? Yeah. So now we almost have in these communities, we have a tradition that is like our tradition, that basically the senior practitioners give the knowledge to the junior practitioners, and yeah, then it's almost like in pre-written cultures, yeah, before we had academic disciplines and handbooks, etc., simply because of the shortage of resources, of time and money, etc. Yeah. Maintenance. Huge problem, and it's not just, you know, with the old analog technologies. Also, if you're a hacker lab and you have to maintain a server, for example, if you say we are hosting open source decentral social networks, the so-called Fediverse, like Mastodon or PeerTube, that are non-commercial alternatives to the mainstream social media services, that suddenly means you get a responsibility. Yeah, it's like community responsibility, and also it's difficult work of keeping these technologies running, and maybe you're underfunded, or you can do this on your community's idealism, but then you burn out after a couple of years. So what we already said before, and I know this well because, full disclosure, I'm also a member of an activist group of Dorbrak. So activist burnout is a typical phenomenon. Most people cannot do it for more than like 5 to 10 years, because at some point your energy is just up. Yeah, because nobody gives you anything back. But in a way, this is also a danger with these things, that suddenly at some point people no longer have the mental capacity of keeping all these systems running and properly maintaining them. Yeah. And then the other thing is, you know, this is a little bit polemical, but yeah, if you look at these spaces, they are messy spaces. Yeah? They're not, let's say, professional art spaces. But this is still the expectation of what art, contemporary art should look like. Yeah? This is the expectation of funding bodies, of policymakers, etc. And for me, a personal experience of how these expectations can totally clash and lead to a complete kind of discommunication, misunderstanding was 2 years ago, Documenta 15, where basically all the collective practices came from similar backgrounds or similar practices as the ones that I presented right now, and the institution was absolutely not prepared for hosting them. Yeah? So the question is, do the funding systems or the institutional systems of the art world even, are they even made for these practices? And that's one of the reasons why I think, yeah, maybe not. I'm not sure. Yeah. And by the way, this was interesting for me. Somebody I've personally really rediscovered in the last couple of years is George Maciunas, who was the founder of Fluxus. And I will round off in a few minutes, which was actually already seen in the 1960s as an issue. So this is his Flux Manifesto, Flux Amusement, where he said, yeah, we need to have a substitute art amusement, which must be simple amusement concerned with insignificances, have no commodity or institutional value, and it must be obtainable by all and eventually produced by all. Yeah? This is from 1964. I think by Fluxus perhaps being the first art movement that radically embraced these tactics, they already saw these challenges back in the time. Yeah, I skip the situation is, I think we're dealing with a problem of the commons, of changing the production models of the arts from classical production models to commons models. And this is exactly also what was addressed by Wong Rupa at Documenta 15. I think it's not the only way of addressing this, but it's part of a bigger problem. Yeah? So this is actually a right-wing troll leaflet, it's by some, I don't know, Forum for Democracy people who say, yeah, here, get your strip, and then George Soros will finally pay you to do your anarchism. Like all the protesters now, like at UVA, they're all financed by George Soros. I just remember how the Black Archives, they were accused by Viaduc to be paid by George Soros, and then they said, if we only were, we would be really happy if George Soros would pay us for this. I mean, yeah, unfortunately, the world is not that simple. If George Soros would pay us all for running these artist film labs and publishing, no, it's not that easy. Yeah, and I think also that's an old anarchist question. Yeah, revolution is fine, but who is doing the dishes, right? And in these practices, it's really about doing the dishes, doing the gritty work, the maintenance work. That's it. Thank you for listening.